So the gene BDNF encodes for BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So if someone has the suboptimal variant, they're more likely to not have enough or not produce enough of the substance. And then they're more likely to have this sort of hamster wheel brain or increased neuroticism, disrupted circadian rhythms, and basically their brain is not repairing quick enough. So they may have some cognitive issues.
Okay. All right. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I have really great guests this week that I'm so excited to share with you. Every week I have on different guests, and they each share their expertise on a particular area of health optimization. So this week happens to be cognitive health, how to optimize your brain, how your brain works, inflammation, behaviors, and how those are exhibited through different genotypes and phenotypes. So the guest is Dr. Adilia Kreps, and I'm really excited because it's the first doctor I've had on the show, which is always exciting. But she's also an expert in DNA, reading DNA profiles, and then being able to tell a person, hey, you need to do this, this, and that in order to have this result. So what a great podcast I have in store for you guys. And it will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, let's do this, Adilia. So I'm really excited to have you on. And it was funny because we've never actually met before, but just online, and I saw you, and I just kind of gravitated towards you, and that's giving the listeners no information. But why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us what you're all about?
Yeah, absolutely. I love getting those random messages that happen to be very synchronous. So as soon as I saw you were into health optimization, I was like, okay, I might actually respond to this one. Then we had a great call the other day. So I'm a naturopathic doctor. I'm based in Montreal, Quebec. So that's the French part of Canada. I lived in Toronto for over 7 years. I did my doctor of naturopathy. And then I was working in biotech for 2 years. So I've had a couple years clinical experience as a naturopathic doctor, and then I've had some interesting experience in genetics and health optimization. So I learned a bunch of stuff in school, theoretically, through kind of personal experience. And then also I learned quite a bit from my biohacker clients, actually, from my time at the DNA company.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because just like you said, theoretically, like when you're in class and you're learning these things, it's amazing. It's fascinating too if you're into it. And that's why people would listen to something like this too. It's really fascinating. But then when you go into practice, it's interesting because sometimes those things that you read on paper don't necessarily translate into real life, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and that's always interesting. But that's what I kind of want to really dive into here. So
Yeah.
how to optimize cognitive function, and that's where you kind of have your specialization. And I know when we talked the other day, you were into obviously you're a doctor of naturopathy, but you got into DNA and genetics, and I think this is such a cool, interesting field. Also, because I'm not involved in it, I'd like to learn more, and I think other people would too. So that's why I really just want to take your brain out and look at what's going on there. But you said that you almost serendipitously got into the DNA and biohacking space. Tell us about that, like what the company does and how you were involved.
Yeah, so it was quite synchronous. So my sister was actually the one that straight out of high school went into the hard sciences. She went into biochem. She was like top of her class in, college, undergrad, and in her master's in biochemistry. And she actually wanted to become a genetic counselor. So it was actually kind of strange that I studied psychology, and then it sort of has a bit of science. And I did start out quite strong in science, but I never had the intention of going into genetics. And then I was essentially almost a genetic counselor in that I was actually just conveying information about people's genetic results and giving them some lifestyle suggestions. So it wasn't clinical genetics per se, in that I was telling people about a specific disease, but I was telling them about how to optimize the expression of their genes.
Well,
And then we also created these custom supplements based on the potential expression of people's genes. So they're called DNA-based supplements. It's kind of a sexy name, but basically we'd look at their health information and their health goals, and then we'd look at their genes. And based on the two, we'd come up with formulas and lifestyle suggestions there. So it was super inspiring. You know, I studied biochem and genetics in school, but I really mastered it once I had that hands-on experience. So,
yeah. And I think something you said there too, is like, you know, you didn't have the necessarily like quote unquote clinical, but I think that's the point. And I think that's why you're so interesting, is our listeners and like me, who I want this information. I want it for me. I want it to optimize myself. I don't necessarily want to go in and say, hey, you know, do I have the genetic marker for Alzheimer's? Although that might be interesting. I want to use this as a tool for biohacking, like you mentioned. I want to use this as a tool to improve myself, to optimize my health or my performance, or again my cognition. So that's really why I think that is so fascinating. Why, like, yeah, you don't have clinical experience, but you have something that can apply to more people. And as we kind of chatted about earlier, this industry is growing so rapidly. Personalization, right? How do I get something for me? How do I take these DNA results and make myself better? How do I take supplements to make myself better? How do I do anything to get better at something or improve my body? And as holistic beings, you know, you improve your brain and something else improves too, and your sleep improves, and it's almost like that domino effect. So I want to dig into the DNA aspect of it and how people can optimize. So why don't I just like jump right into it? Can anyone use a DNA test to optimize their cognition?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the rare person, the very rare person that has an optimal profile across the board. So I think one of the paradigm shifts that's happened in the last couple of years is more and more people are understanding that disease is a spectrum, illness is a spectrum, rather. So we have people with optimal cognitive function on one end, quote unquote, nobody's quite there. And then we have people with full-blown Alzheimer's or depression or mental health issues on the other side. So most of us are somewhere in between, and very few, if any of us, really have the optimal genes across the board in terms of our mental function. So just to give you an idea, I have low dopamine binding, just to give you like a personal sort of anecdote. So that means that the pleasure response is not quite as acute for smaller everyday things. So sometimes people with low dopamine tend to be the adventurers or the novelty seekers or the risk takers or the entrepreneurs, or the people with ADHD or addiction.
And so, sorry, so because they're not getting the same response from a smaller stimulus, that's why they make these more outlandish goals.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one manifestation, and it didn't necessarily lead to a clinical result, at least at this point in time. But it just gives you an idea of how these genes can shape your personality, if not lead to disease down the road. So in terms of the disease progression, that's very much modifiable, especially in terms of the genes we were focusing on. So David Sinclair, he's an expert in longevity and anti-aging, world renowned. He estimates approximately 80% of our longevity and health is dependent on our lifestyle, not our genes. So dopamine, just as one example, is something you can modify.
Right.
Coffee increases your dopamine. Cardiovascular exercise increases your dopamine. Certain supplements like tyrosine can increase your dopamine. Also, just having loftier goals can increase your dopamine.
Wow. So there's lots that people can do, which is really nice to hear. But you mentioned like someone, it's very rare. You said that someone has optimal genes. So let's take that scenario then. Someone's born with optimal genes, they can degrade, or they can not be. How does that work? Where someone is born with those optimal genes, but they lessen over time, or they're not stimulated enough? Explain how that works.
Yeah, so that's the difference between your genotype, which is the actual genetic markers, which you won't change your genotype, but you can change the expression, which is your phenotype. And some people refer to that as epigenetics.
Okay, yeah.
So epigenetics is a bit of a complicated term, actually, but for simplicity, it's basically your epigenetics that we're working with. So I did a lot of genetic consults where I would give people the highlights of their profiles. And one thing I noticed was there were people that had no negative expression, but they had poor genes. So if we're talking about brain health, for example, and we did share some of our genes among colleagues. So there were a few people that were very high functioning, but they almost across the board had sort of suboptimal variations. But because of their lifestyle and upbringing, as an example, they hadn't manifested the negative expression of those genes.
And do you think, and I know this is just personal, do you think that's because it was just by chance that they purposely took care of themselves because they felt something, or what would have made them like, because if they're born, like, let's just say, and I know I'm trying to get my head around this too, they're not optimal, but they've pushed themselves to perform optimally, and that's because they chose to make changes in their lifestyle and their diet. How did they know to do that? Had they done DNA testing at that point?
So it can be one or the other. So even in mental illness, we talk about people coming up with adaptations. So even someone who has clinical ADHD can sometimes figure out their way around it, adapt their lifestyle to their particular limitations. So just one example is I know of someone who has the lowest dopamine binding. So they have a couple of different genes that all mean that they have like very little sort of innate pleasure response. But instead of becoming depressed or, having ADHD or having addiction, they invested all that energy into business. So they essentially became addicted to business one day.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's an example of how someone worked with their genes before they knew their genetic results.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that person could have come in and been, actually, frankly, addicted to something and taken lifestyle recommendations to modify the expression. So it can be by chance or environment, but it can also be something that's in your own power. Absolutely.
Yeah. And in this case, like you were talking about this person, it was almost like intuitively they did something to gain pleasure or whatever it is. But speaking about like that person or that type of example, so someone has suboptimal, they make the necessary changes, whether it was by chance or they directly did it.
Yeah.
I don't know if this question makes sense, but how long does that last? Do you know what I mean? Like, so let's say, you're here on the scale and you've pushed yourself into the optimal side, but then you stop performing those behaviors that helped you. Will you slide back here? Is that something that you watched for, or you watch for with patients? How long does that take? Or
Yeah, it's kind of like even in Asian medicine, we have this spectrum where we're all prone to disease in certain areas. Some of us have brains that are more prone to inflammation, others have hearts that are more prone to inflammation. So that person will tend towards addiction or tend towards ADHD. But with the right lifestyle and the right implementation, they can kind of keep bringing themselves back to center in a way that's more balanced.
So it'll always go back to that naturally born position unless you're constantly doing something. Wow. Okay. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, so can you then, because I really want to focus on like the cognitive part of this too, like, becoming smarter or, reducing
Yeah,
inflammation in the
absolutely.
brain. And
Yeah.
you said something really interesting. The last time we talked was that, okay, there's, you have your genes and you can be either in the middle or you can be optimal or you can be suboptimal. It's like those
Yeah,
three. So it's very easy to
exactly.
understand.
Mhm.
Um, but you also mentioned that like each side of the spectrum can manifest something negative or something positive. Like you said, I think, and
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but one side was like ADD, and then in the middle, and then the other side was OCD. So it's like
Yeah.
you don't really want either of those. Can you kind of talk about like what gene that was, and how that plays out?
Yeah, sure. So not all genes are the same in that regard, but generally speaking, there's kind of three variations because you get one allele from one parent and one allele from the other. So basically, if you take COMT as an example, so
And
it's like
so,
either.
and COMT is a gene.
Yeah,
Okay.
COMT is a gene. It encodes for an enzyme that's also COMT
Okay.
in terms of the acronym. And that enzyme breaks down neurotransmitters. So there's three variations there. There's fast COMT, there's slow COMT, and there's medium COMT. So if you got one of the fast ones from one parent and one of the slow ones, then you end up medium. So that's how it's like three, basically.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Um, but some of the genes are different in that two would be bad or two would be good. But anyways, COMT is really interesting because if you have fast COMT, that would make you more likely to break down dopamine really quickly. And if you have medium COMT, that's good. That's the best one, kind of.
Hmm.
So the fast would be more on the ADD side of the spectrum, or the context switching, the multitasking, the moving a lot, more like the hyperactive type of ADHD. And then on the slow side would be more prone to more extremes in emotions, like either bipolar or more prone to OCD. So
I see.
like you said, to put it simply, ADHD on the fast side and then OCD on the slow side.
Okay.
Again, doesn't mean that if you have those variations, you will have those mental health issues, but they are among the correlations.
Yeah, and I know I'm really oversimplifying it because I don't know what I'm talking about. That's why I have you. But so is it possible then that someone has ADD and they're suffering from it, let's say, so they're on this side, and then they take some measures, into their own hands, and they want to bring that back towards the center. Could
Mhm.
that person then go too far and start to slip towards OCD?
Yeah.
Is that
Mhm.
possible? Like this is a really fine almost game you're playing then.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So, just as an example, like in a clinical context, if we take a drug like Adderall, it increases dopamine by actually a huge percentage. So, let's say someone is not breaking down that dopamine quickly enough, they could veer towards the OCD side of the
Oh,
spectrum,
wow.
as an example.
Wow.
Because not only will it increase dopamine, it will increase norepinephrine, which is a stress hormone. It's adrenaline.
Hmm.
So dopamine converts to norepinephrine. So yeah, it's a fine line, basically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a very fine line. Wow, that's really interesting. So what impact do you think that genes play in cognition then? All of it? Like obviously we have some say, like I get, your lifestyle, your diet, all of these things, but genes have everything then to do with cognition.
Yeah, they have everything to do with cognition, but we actually have most of the control. We have 80% of the control.
80%.
Essentially. So that means that there are certain genes, which I haven't studied, that are directly correlated with illnesses, but the vast majority of our genetic expression is under our control.
Wow. So we
So,
have 80%. Yeah, like you said,
yeah,
that's a really huge number. So
it is,
so
yeah.
people would want to say then, how can I optimize this? So could you, and I know that's a really loaded question. There's so much that could last for hours, that answer, but let's break it down for someone, because I know also, Adelia, that you work with like high performing executives,
Mhm.
right? They
Yeah.
want to make the best decisions possible. So just for that sake, what like top, let's say 3 genes do you look at, and how does that like manifest in people? Those genes, what do they do?
Yeah. So my experience is more in mental health, but I am transitioning into more of the optimization side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that means people who are generally healthy, but they may have a poor stress response and they may not be sleeping well. They may have trouble with focus.
Perfect. Yeah.
Because disease is a spectrum, as we talked about before. So one interesting gene, as an example, is BDNF. Um, I've looked at that one a lot. I would say the majority of people are fine on that gene from the data set I've seen.
And what does BDNF do for people listening? Because I've heard this before. The first time I heard about it was in was like what, Dave Perlmutter?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, his book, and I heard about it. It's like something to protect the brain.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us what it's about. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting in that it's connected with neural plasticity. So the ability for our brain to repair after mental trauma or physical trauma. So if someone has a concussion, for example, we want BDNF. So the gene BDNF encodes for BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So if someone has the suboptimal variant, they're more likely to not have enough or not produce enough of the substance. And then they're more likely to have this sort of hamster wheel brain or increased neuroticism, disrupted circadian rhythms, and basically their brain is not repairing quick enough. So they may have some cognitive issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So,
yeah.
And so that's BDNF. What's another one? I know you mentioned COMT as well, BDNF.
Yeah, so COMT is a big one for sure. So I have definitely seen a lot of the entrepreneurial types tend to have fast COMT. So it's kind of interesting how people pick a lifestyle that sometimes is correlated with their genes.
Yeah.
And so, like, just as an example, if you have fast COMT, you can drink green tea, and that slows down COMT. If you have slow COMT, you can drink yerba mate, which actually speeds up COMT.
Oh, wow.
So I actually have slow COMT with low dopamine, which is actually a very rare combination.
Not to have those two. Okay. Yeah.
It's apparently quite rare, but yerba mate just really agrees with me. So those are just like 2 examples. The examples are endless, really. Yeah. So for BDNF, saunas increase BDNF, sunlight increases BDNF. For the saunas, it's infrared saunas. There's a bunch of supplements like green coffee fruit extract, especially can increase BDNF. Another interesting one that really affects stress is ADRA2B. So that's basically your binding for adrenaline. So like for, high performing people that have an increased stress response and they have that variation, they're going to want to do more mindfulness or tapping, or like there's a whole bunch of stress reducing exercises, but basically just knowing they have that gene, they're going to want to really focus on the stress management piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. So you mentioned a few things there, like green tea and yerba mate and all of these things. Is it safe for people to play around with those? Like, can anyone say, oh, okay, well, I heard that. Should they try it? Is this something where they should go to you, like go to a naturopathic doctor and say, hey, I need some help here? Or are people kind of free to experiment with those things, do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a naturopathic doctor, I wouldn't necessarily encourage people to experiment too much on their own. However, for things like green tea and yerba mate, I mean, they're pretty benign. You can only do so much damage with substances like that. Technically, when we're in the realm of biohacking and you're taking a little more potent substances, you should be ideally consulting with a healthcare practitioner. Yeah. So I would say that's really up to the individual, though. I would always recommend they go see a healthcare practitioner, but I'll leave that up to
Yeah,
date.
I'm not trying to get you in any hot water or anything. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
But for the DNA itself, obviously, like we have to go to someone. Like I can't
Yeah.
really do my own DNA. Is there a better test? Are they all the same? Like I'll just say an example because again, I really don't know this realm. It's very fascinating to me. Everyone's sort of like 23andMe, and it kind of gives your ancestry, but they give more genetic markers now, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Would I be able to go to that and then show you my results, or do I have to go to a specific place where they look for specific genes in a specific way? What are the differences with what commercially people have access to?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it keeps changing. So the company worked for was the DNA company, and I'm not affiliated um, right now. They are one company that like overall is very helpful from a lifestyle perspective. So it was more clinically focused and less just for entertainment purposes, let's say, than 23andMe. So they were testing, and I don't know if things have changed, but they were testing at a lab at McGill. And so they actually had people manually testing, as opposed to running the genes through a mass array system, which just picks up SNPs. And apparently there were issues with accuracy, but also they include a bunch of genes that aren't necessarily as relevant.
Wow.
So
That's
ideally,
good to know. That's really good to know.
yeah. And then another one that's kind of on my radar right now is Inside Tracker. So
I've heard
again,
of this company.
yeah, so this isn't a promotion. I'm not affiliated with them. But some of their advisors are really like some of the most amazing people in their fields. So I know Dr. Sinclair, that longevity expert, is an advisor for them, and they do blood work and genetic markers. So they do genetic testing and blood work, and I think it's all in one, and it's accessible to the consumers directly. So that's pretty interesting, for the type of people that really want to take charge of their health themselves. That's definitely a company that's on my radar now that I might start using with clients, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really interesting too, that, you can use a blood and DNA together and possibly urine or tissue mineral analysis. You can use all these things in combination. But that being said, what do you think? And this is personal, but what's the like one to go for? If you're going to pick one test, if I could do a tissue mineral analysis, or I could do blood work and I can only pick one, or I can do DNA, what do you think is more helpful for people if they want to just, again, optimize their health? They're not looking for disease. We're not there. Our health is good,
Mhm.
but we want to have great health or amazing health, not just good. What's the one test that you would recommend?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for my private clients, I usually just start with their basic blood work. So sometimes people will be like not out of range because the regular range is only designed to pick up disease, right? But let's say we're looking at something like ferritin, which is related to your iron, just that alone can cause issues with focus. Or if your TSH is too high and then you have thyroid issues, that can cause fatigue, or depression, which will interfere with your cognitive function. So it all depends on
Yeah.
like which level you're at. Like after that, you might want to do urinary markers, or you might want to do metabolic testing. And I'm sure you know about that, like for the nutrients and stuff. And then you might want to do DNA. DNA
Yes.
is a bit after the basics, I would say.
Yeah. So from what you're saying it's like after, so maybe potentially I look at my blood work, and I'm seeing a professional like you. We say, hey, I see this blood work. There's something interesting here. I'd like to test your DNA to kind of confirm or rule something out. Is it used
Yeah.
sort of like that? Is it a tool to look even deeper?
Yes. Yeah,
Ah, okay.
essentially. So even, this world-renowned genomic expert that I worked with, who I don't know if he likes people using his name, but he said phenotype, as in someone's expression, is always more important than the genes.
Okay.
So just like we said, lifestyle and your health presentation is 80% of what ends up happening, that's actually the most important. But then when you're going to the next level and you're biohacking and you're optimizing, then you'll want to see sort of your hardware essentially.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that's good for people to know. Okay. I do have control over this. I have control over 80%, and that 80% is more important than the rest of it anyways. So that's great for people who want to biohack, who want to optimize their health, that they do have control, and that control matters as well. So I know you touched on some specifics, comp, BDNF, ADRA2B. I'm like writing these down. It looks like a different language on my paper, but we test these things. Now, what are some things after you do a DNA test? And I know you touched on a couple, like the green tea and stuff, but what can people do to impact their epigenetics? What are the best things? Of course, lifestyle, but that's a little broad. What are like the best things? And I guess I'm talking about cognitive function, because that's what we're focusing on. What are some of the best practices for optimizing cognitive function? Is it waking up? Is it fasting? Like, what do we do? I want to optimize my cognitive function.
Okay. So testing your genes is helpful. I'm not going to lie in this area. Like when I first got my results, I was like, oh my God, this all makes so much sense. And, you sort of have those aha moments. You have a day or two to process what it means. And then it all sort of makes sense essentially. So it is helpful, but we can also start with the basics. So probably the most important thing for cognitive function overall is sleep. So that's why, Aura rings have taken off and everyone's into sleep now. Yeah.
Did you get yours yet?
This is my sizing ring.
So
I just bought it the other day, so I'm going to get my real ones too.
Yeah, good.
A little behind the curve on that one. So optimizing sleep. And there's a bunch of other gadgets. Like I use an Apollo. Again, this isn't a promo or anything. That one uses like vagus nerve entrainment, which puts you into a more relaxed state. And anecdotally, I know people who have improved their HRV like overnight. With that. Breathing exercises as well can increase sleep. So the first thing is sleep. The second thing is definitely stress reduction. So everybody's focus for the most part is going to be off if they're under chronic stress. That being said, acute stress sometimes can help narrow your focus in certain situations, but overall chronic stress is going to make your cognitive function go down and your performance at work go down, particularly over time.
Yeah, I want to keep going on some of these like best practices, but that was really interesting that acute stress can actually help, like just for a short time. So could you give us like an example of that, where stress, because I know there's some people, and maybe it's more old school, but I'm sure there's people now too, where it's like, no, I can take the stress. Like it's the macho thing to take it, but in the long run, it's probably not good because it's, deteriorating your body, your sleep, all these things. But a little bit of stress can be good. Like, give us an example of where that might be helpful, or how to know.
Yeah, so stress is like a curve, right? So you actually do need a little bit of stress to be in optimal health. So we're finding that more and more, that it's about your adaptation to stressors as opposed to no stress or having stress. So there actually is an optimal zone, like when you have just enough cortisol and just enough epinephrine or adrenaline, and then you're kind of in the optimal zone. But once you get past that peak, that's when you're in the zone of not being able to focus and not being able to sleep and having mental health issues. So it's kind of like a curve. But if you have these short bursts of epinephrine or dopamine for, let's say, a couple hours before an exam, just to give it, or a presentation, to give an example, that can actually help your performance. And sometimes it's helpful for people to know that, because if they think that stress is bad, their stress gets even worse.
I've done that to myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
and I know this is probably like very subjective, but how would I know? And let me tell me if I'm thinking about this the right way. So to make it simple, having a deadline could be a good thing for me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
having 10 deadlines could be
Yeah.
too much. Is there a way, or is it totally personal, for how to know what the limit is for in terms of it being of benefit to you?
Yeah. Mm. So everybody's limit is different. And a lot of your performance depends on your particular nervous system's capacity, right? But your nervous system's capacity can also be modified, just like the expression of your genes.
So we can handle more stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So tell us about that. Okay, well, maybe I'll back. I know I'm getting really excited about this conversation. Is there a genetic marker for how we handle stress?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
there are several. I mean, there are a few
You
that
mentioned the one before, ADRA2B. That's adrenal. So is that a determiner for how much stress someone can undergo?
yeah, to some extent. So if someone has high sensitivity to adrenaline, so that's the most suboptimal one, generally speaking, they'll be more prone to trauma, and they'll be more prone to anxiety and an increased fear response, and basically a poor stress response. So that's just one example. Another example is if someone has slow comped, so that was like the one that makes you maybe more prone to OCD or bipolar, and then they also have high dopamine, which high dopamine is generally good, but the two together can make you have a really increased stress response because
Wow.
dopamine converts to adrenaline.
Yes.
So there are several markers. There's also 5-HTT-LPR, not to overload with too much info, but that one's correlated with serotonin production. And if you have the suboptimal variation there, you can have increased anxiety and irritability and sleep issues. So
Wow.
almost all of them, all of the main cognitive ones can be related to stress response.
Yeah.
So it kind of shows us how stress is really at the root of a lot of cognitive issues.
And you've heard that before too, I'm sure. Like even when
Yeah.
you were in school, and myself too, is that stress is really one of the underlying conditions or things that's present in almost all cases of disease, that in some fashion it either brings it out, like it manifests itself, or it makes it a little more extreme, or it compounds the issue. That it's
Yeah.
really interesting to see that, and then all these genetic markers play into stress. Now, this is a little bit of a jump for a question, but would you have any idea why? Is this like an evolutionary thing? Why are we so hardwired to respond to these stress, and so many genes impact stress, and stress is impacting so many people?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, when you're in a sympathetic state, yeah, and you know about the autonomic nervous system. Like when you're in the parasympathetic, that's rest and digest, and you have more blood shunted to your organs, like your digestive system. And then when you're in the sympathetic, so that's the more stressed response, basically. The blood gets shunted to your muscles so you can like run, and so essentially you have less blood to help your internal organs, including your brain to some extent, because basically that activity goes to your hindbrain. So your hindbrain will help you run, from the tiger or the stressor, but it won't help you necessarily plan or remain calm.
The prefrontal cortex isn't necessary, so you can run from the tiger, but you don't know where to go because you're not smart enough to. Is that the idea?
Well, presumably there was less complexity in a lot of those situations than our modern environment, which is so complex, which can create more chronic stress. Just those bursts of stress, which can be a good thing.
Again, yeah, like you mentioned. Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So someone would have to do a DNA test, though, to figure these things out, because like you mentioned, some of these things are rare. You have to have this genetic marker switched this way and this one switched another way just for this to manifest, and no one would ever know that. So do you think that people who are feeling really stressed, of course, I'm going to ask you some things for them to do. And I know people, meditate in this, but I'm going to ask you your personal opinion. But should they go get a DNA test?
So it depends. Like I think of things like start where you are. So if someone, let's say, hasn't even had their basic blood work, and let's say they have other health issues, they want to take care of that first. Because if you have gut issues, it will affect your cognitive function. If you have cardiovascular issues, it can affect your cognitive function. Basically, your holistic body health will affect your cognitive function because your brain is another organ, essentially.
Yeah.
So start there, start with the basics, start with sleep, cleaning up your diet, maybe taking some basic supplements that essentially are good for most people, like vitamin D, magnesium at night, like, a bunch of these food-based probiotics. And then I would say that if, let's say, they're struggling with a particular issue, it could definitely be helpful to know where it's coming from genetically, because it is our hardware, basically.
Yeah.
Like, our genes have specific signals, and we all have a very specific combination of them that's unique to us. So it is helpful to know.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful for people who really want the answers. The traditional form of medicine, and I'm not knocking any profession or anything. We're all trained differently, and you kind of hone your skills in that. And that's what you focus on, and maybe rightfully so. But the traditional sense is just, okay, I go for an answer. They give me the answer in a pill, and I take it. Now, consumers, people like you and I, are kind of taking that power back and saying, what's exactly going on with my switchboard, my circuitry, my organs, what's that going, and how can I optimize that again for me? So a DNA test almost would be necessary in some sense to get to the real nitty gritty of it, right?
Yeah. So let's say someone has stress, and that's like a really general symptom, right? Mental stress. If they get a genetic test and they find out that they have suboptimal BDNF as opposed to ADRA2B, they'll have different interventions. So if they have the suboptimal BDNF, they might start going for infrared saunas. They might really focus more on sunlight exposure, and they may take particular supplements like green coffee fruit extract.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's exactly kind of what I was going for. So let's just say that. So that was BDNF you were talking about, right? And we know an infrared sauna will help.
Yeah.
So if someone has ADRA2B and it's not BDNF and they use an infrared sauna, is that helpful at all?
It could be helpful because there's a good chance it will increase their BDNF as well. And that's a good thing.
It's always a good, yeah, of course. It's always a good thing.
I mean, we all have it somewhat, but it's a good thing to increase, right? Yeah. But then the supplements would likely look different. So like on my short list, I have ginseng, rhodiola, and theanine for helping the expression of ADRA2B. And so this is a combination of like research and like clinical experience and data that I've acquired. But the supplements are somewhat different, and the lifestyle recommendations are somewhat different too. Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense. And that's kind of like what it's about, like with optimizing, right? It's how do we actually know what we need? Like that's the most basic question when it comes to optimizing. Most people go to a health food store or whatever, and they make selections, or even the grocery store, off of recommendations from their neighbor. I took vitamin C when I had a cold, so now you got to take. Well, maybe you're not actually missing that, or you're talking about green tea, and maybe that's not actually the one for you. And I think that this is a big reason why people lose faith in 100%. Supplements, because you are sold on it. Well, you might just not need that one, you need this one. There's no question of that. You just don't need anything. And I'm sort of the same. We need them, but we need to find out like which ones do I need specifically and how much amounts. And I think the science is getting to a point where we can actually figure that out now. Is that kind of like what the revolution of DNA? Do you think that's bringing? It's like, hey, we know ginseng's good for energy. I don't need to question that, but is it good for my energy?
Yeah, yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I mean, I actually did a post on this, so I don't know if you got a sneak peek, but
I
this
never saw it, but this is great.
just fires me up because basically in the supplements world, so we have some brands that are better at one supplement than another. We have some brands that are just overall better quality. We have different sourcing, we have different dosing, and then timing. And then we also want to make sure that it's the right supplement for that person, like you said, or their condition. So between all those factors, people end up buying supplements where they're basically throwing their money away.
Totally.
They're not looking at their particular blood work or genetics or even diagnosis, and they're buying a supplement sort of willy-nilly. So yeah, it helps to have that information, and it also helps to talk to a professional, either a holistic nutritionist or a naturopathic doctor or someone with a strong grasp on supplements, because it takes years to figure out that world. I worked in natural health, and I'm sure you did at some point, right? And then I also did my doctorate degree, and then I also worked in biotech. And still there's like tons of products out there that I don't know about. So
Well, that is like my whole being is like,
yeah,
how do you know? And that part of it too, that some people have been turned off for that very reason. Well, I
yeah,
took this one, and I'll give a quick example because I actually worked at GNC when I was like putting myself through university, like,
right.
and I had the best intentions in the world. But you got to
Mhm.
remember, I was still 18, 19 years old, and we got paid commission. And there were certainly times where me and the other employee said, "Hey, I'm going to give you $5 if you sell this to the next person, no matter what they want." And I had all the good intentions, but yeah, you're really just asking someone's opinion
Yeah,
for a health indicator for someone you want to help with who doesn't know you, who just met you, who might be being paid commission to sell this one rather than this one. And
yeah,
then I think people get turned off, and that's really it. Is like getting people to trust a science behind the recommendations. That's where I think DNA is going to be an industry leader, because like you hear DNA and just sort of comes with that confidence, for
yeah.
no other reason. It's like, oh, it's my DNA. It's got to be right.
Your genes don't change. So
Mhm.
the expression of your genes changes again, but the genes don't change. That's your hardwiring. And so unless the test is inaccurate, it's a really good sort of roadmap to
Mhm.
have in your hands for sure.
Well, okay, I won't keep it too much longer, but is
Yeah.
that possible that you could do two different DNA tests and get conflicting results? And then I have a kind of follow-up question to that, but does that happen?
I have heard of that happening. Like, I don't want to throw any particular company under the bus, but I have heard of those mass array systems that test SNPs sometimes being inaccurate.
Okay. Yeah. And I know mistakes happen. Listen, there's
Yeah.
people who go and check the sex of their baby and they get it wrong. And mistakes happen. We get that. But it's rare, you would say, unless they're using a mass array that's less reliable.
It depends on the company. So I can't really speak to companies like 23andMe. Like through the grapevine, I have heard that there were issues with accuracy.
Yeah.
So it does depend on which company you go with. Generally speaking, your genes are your genes, and you're gonna get the accurate answer, particularly if you're going with a more sort of customized, smaller company.
Yeah. Okay.
Generally.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that'll kind of lead me to the last question that I'll hound you with here. So you can take two different tests and get conflicting results. But let's say you stick with the same company and you test yourself, and then you want to see if the supplements, the lifestyle, the diet made a difference. How often do you retest your genes to see if there was improvement, or possibly it worsened? How often would you test yourself, or how quickly would you be able to see a result?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Like I've even got that question from clinicians, because like the genes don't change, right? So if you're going through a reliable company and it's more focused on clinical genes, you don't need to get retested ever,
Mhm.
right? Because, as we said, the actual genes don't change. But one thing you want to get retested is your blood work, particularly if you had, not optimal results there, or things like metabolic testing or urine testing, like the Dutch test, if you're looking at hormones, for example. So all of those change, depending on the day or the month or the year. So you'll start to see the improvements not through your genes, but the expression of your genes. And that would be through blood tests and urine tests.
Right. So they can't necessarily measure the improvement, but you would feel it. Oh, hey, I'm not as stressed. So that's an obvious indicator, but they can't necessarily give an objective measurement to you got 10% better or anything like
they
that.
Can.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So there's more to this. Okay.
Yeah. So you can, if let's say you're looking at your basic blood work, you can see changes once you get better. If you're looking at your metabolic testing for like nutrients, you can see improvements there. For your hormone testing, you can see improvements there. Mm-hmm. So if you look at your hardwiring through the genes, you make modifications, then you'll see the improvements on the other testing.
I see.
I know it's a bit complicated, right?
Well, there's a lot, and I think that's why this is so interesting, and why we can have a conversation for probably 6 hours. And people would ask questions that I haven't even thought of. Is there's so many different ways to take. I want myself and people who listen or watch this to say, hey, I can use this test, I can get this, and then fine. Now that's the limitation. Now I can use blood work and get this. Now I can do the Dutch test and get this. That's fine. We just want to know the limitations. We want to know what we can do, what we can get back from it. And then with that information, how do I optimize my health with it? So that's really amazing. Why don't we leave it as, give us your best one single tip. If someone can do only one thing, how to optimize. I know you said sleep, but we're going to pick a different one. One best practice for optimizing. Is there a way to optimize all genes? Is there just a best practice for you see an improvement in everything? Is there anything like that?
For genes across the board, I mean, other than sleep being one of the top ones, I would say just understanding, and I actually think sometimes it comes down to knowledge, understanding that health is a spectrum and that it's 80% in your control is probably the biggest health hack that I can think of.
It's almost empowering to know that, in a way, right? That you do have control, that what you're doing matters. And it's going to impact your health, not only today, but tomorrow and the day after, and for years to come.
Exactly. You can change your epigenome, so the expression of your genes, and you can change your cellular health. You can change your cellular age. And you can also just change how you feel.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
And that's usually the biggest thing. And I've had a lot of these conversations. And someone else said that too, is like how you feel. Even though it's subjective, that's really how we measure anything. That's really what you want. And even though the blood work can tell me, hey, this marker, improved by 2.3%. It's like, well, what does that mean? Oh, I feel better. That's all I care about, is like the feeling of that. So that's really great, Adilia. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I know everyone will love listening to this. I'm going to have to, I say this to everyone, but I'm going to have you back on because it's just not long enough. But thank you so much. And where can we find you if we're looking for you?
So at this point, LinkedIn. So Adilia Kreps, Adilia Kreps, or on Instagram, Dr. Adilia Kreps. So those would be probably the two main ways at this.
Awesome. And your main focus, obviously, you're a naturopathic doctor, which is just incredible and quite an accomplishment in itself. But you're like the go-to person if we're looking for cognitive improvement. That's your kind of like your.
Exactly. Yeah. So issues like ADHD, depression, I've actually had a lot of luck with helping people with that. Anxiety, and even just regular issues like stress and lack of focus and sleep. Those would all be within my wheelhouse, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's almost sad that you say like regular issues. And it's true. It's like stress and sleep problems are just regular now, but Again, thank you so much. Just incredible. And your knowledge is just out of this world. So thank you so much, Adilia.
Thanks so much for having me, Cameron.